she didn't just illustrate the tarot, she really taught our modern world how to see tarot. There's something so haunting about that. The woman who gives us the high priestess, like she's the one that created the high priestess, yet for a period of time she was completely erased from history. I mean, that feels wild, right? She had this very quiet, creative, enduring power. She wasn't loud and bold about it, but through her creativity, she created something that is so long-standing, and I find that just to be so incredibly beautiful. Welcome to Big Crystal Energy, Season 3, the Veil Season. I'm Ashleigh, and I live at the threshold. Between medicine and magic, between the visible world and what waits just beyond it, between the person I present and the witch I am. I've learned something. The in-between isn't a problem to solve. It's a place of power. This season, we're exploring the veil, where Victorian women spoke for the dead, where fairies guard the crossroads, where glamour becomes armor, where you stop apologizing for being both things at once. The crystals have always known the way through. Let me show you. Welcome back to Big Crystal Energy, my beautiful magical souls. I'm Ashleigh, and I am so thrilled because today I am going to share with you an episode that I have just been having the best time researching and putting together to tie a bow on our Victorian spiritual series, Victorian Spiritualism series, if I can talk. Anyway, so today we are closing out the Victorian Spiritualism series, and I have been really intentional about how I wanted to end this because we've explored the Fox sisters in my interview with Steele. We talked about séance culture, spirit photography, ectoplasm, belief, fraud, and that pretty thin, fragile line between devotion and debunking. We talked a lot about this in my interview with Steele Alexandra Doris, who is just she's like a PhD in all of these things. So that was incredible. I hope you loved that episode. But the deeper that I have gone into researching this area, the more I realized Victorian spiritualism was not just about ghosts. It was really about power, specifically about women finding ways to claim intellectual and spiritual authority in a society that denied them almost every other form of power. Women in the 19th century could not vote. Their property rights were limited. Higher education was restricted. Public speaking was controversial. Theology and philosophy were overwhelmingly dominated by men. And yet, in darkened parlors, crowded lecture halls, printed books, esoteric societies, and eventually symbolic systems that we still use today, women stepped forward and claimed authorship of meaning. So today I'm structuring this episode around these 5 archetypes. There's 5 women, 5 expressions of spiritual authority, 5 ways of stepping through the veil. We're going to explore the trance speaker, the movement builder, the esoteric architect, the embodied medium, and the symbolic visionary. Okay. And what we're really asking is this. All right. How did women use spirituality not just to speak to the dead, but to speak for themselves? So let's begin. Okay. This is a big episode. I'm very excited to dive in. So, as I said, there's 5 archetypes. The first archetype is the trance speaker. So I'm talking specifically about Cora L. V. Scott, or Cora Hatch. She was born April 21st, 1840 and died January 3rd, 1923. Who she was. She was born near Cuba, New York in 1840. She became one of the most famous trance lecturers of the 19th century, spiritualism. She was part of a network of public speakers who delivered talks while in these altered trance states. Her family had connections to Universalism and moved through intentional communities, including the Hopedale community, before relocating to Wisconsin, where her trance abilities reportedly emerged and then became publicly showcased. The headline, she began speaking publicly as a child, and audience treated her as a genuine intellectual phenomenon. Her trance lectures weren't just messages from like a grandma. They were often framed as moral philosophy, religious reform, metaphysics, and the nature of the soul, and big ideas delivered by someone who socially would not have been granted that platform as herself because she was just a child. So she was just a child. She was in these trance states and she was delivering these huge lectures. And her power wasn't power because she was loud. It was because it was power through this plausible deniability. Victorian culture was far more willing to tolerate women speaking about theology and metaphysics if she claimed that it's not me speaking, it's the spirit world speaking. The spirits are speaking through me. It's not my ideas, it's the spirit's ideas. It's the spirit's philosophy. And so as a child, she wouldn't have been able to just get up on stage and say all of this stuff. But because she was channeling a spirit, then people took what she said and they took it very seriously. So she was kind of like this archetype of a woman who accesses philosophical authority through trance. And this was kind of like a culturally acceptable loophole at that time. It was a woman who, by speaking in trance, could do what women were discouraged to do from what they were doing in walking life, like teach publicly. So at that time, women weren't really encouraged to teach publicly, but through her trance state, she could. And it's kind of interesting because in this way, she was speaking, but she was hiding behind her trance. You know, but even if you think that her trance was, let's say, performative in any way, it's interesting because the outcome ultimately was still the same. She got on stage and she was able to speak philosophy. And whether or not the philosophy was something that she created herself or that others influenced upon her, she was still able to communicate that with an audience. And so the question for her is, was the trance a mask or was it a doorway for her? I don't know. Cora is able to show us that loophole. Women were speaking because the spirits allowed it. But the next archetype that I'm going to discuss is where women start building the movement itself. So archetype number 2 is the movement builder. And I'm going to talk about Emma Hardinge Britten. She was born on May 2nd, 1823, and she passed away on October 2nd, 1899. Emma Hardinge Britten was born in London in 1823 and became a major figure of early modern Victorian spiritualism as a writer, orator, trance clairvoyant, and medium. She trained and worked as a performer, an opera singer, she had a stage career, which matters because it gave her presence, it gave her voice, and it commanded public attention, which are skills that she later applied in her spiritualist lecturing. And her books included Modern American Spiritualism in 1870 and 19th Century Miracles in 1884, which are major written accounts that shaped how the movement understood itself. She didn't just participate in this spiritualist movement. She is the one that really started organizing the meaning behind it. She is often described as a woman who helped shift spiritualism from like a parlor phenomenon where people were just sitting around in a parlor to more of a public movement where there were these public lectures, there was a written doctrine, and this historical narration of like, this is what we are and why we matter. And she is often credited with helping define the 7 principles of spiritualism that later became foundational in organized spiritualist traditions. Emma is where we see philosophy turning into infrastructure. Cora shows the voice, right? And then she had the voice, she was speaking on the stages, she was a young person commanding attention. And then Emma, she started creating the framework. So her power was more through articulation, where Emma could argue, persuade, narrate, because she had that previous experience. And she also could document. She was writing this movement into legitimacy. She was documenting all the things that were going on. And then she helped create that 7 principles of spiritualism. So, when you're thinking about it, it's like one thing to have this experience, right? Or it's one thing to have a trance channeling experience. It's one thing to share this with an audience, but it's another thing to build an entire philosophy around it, something that can go on past when you're even alive anymore. And when you are the writer of the history, you can really control how the story goes, right? So Emma is someone that really understood the power behind writing the story itself and not just getting on the stage and speaking it out, but actually documenting what was going on. And this is where the spirit world becomes more of a world view. Emma built spiritualism into a movement with principles and history. And then we meet someone who doesn't just build a movement. We're going to talk about someone that built an entire ecosystem. And I'm talking about someone that you're probably very familiar with. You may not be as familiar with the first 2 women that I discussed, but most likely you are familiar with this next one. Archetype number 3 is the esoteric architect. Okay. I'm talking about Helena Petrovna Blavatsky. She was alive from 1831 to 1891, and many people know her as Madame Blavatsky, and she was a very famous figure at this time. Okay, she was born in Russia in 1831, and she became one of the most influential occult writers of the 19th century. In 1875, she co-founded the Theosophical Society with Henry Alcott and William Quan Judge. And I'm going to explain the Theosophical Society a little bit for listeners that are not as familiar. And this was a really good, interesting learning point for me as well. So this was not just another one of the séance clubs that were getting together during the spiritualist time. In my interview with Steele, in her book, Spirits, Seekers, and Seances, she talks a lot about how during the spiritualist movement, people were getting together and having these seance clubs or these seance practice sessions. The Theosophical Society is completely different from that. They had a very definitive purpose. They created this nucleus of universal brotherhood beyond race, creed, sex, any of those kinds of things. They encourage this comparative study of religion, philosophy, and science. So spirituality becomes something that you can examine and synthesize, and not just something that you believe, which is very interesting. And they were investigating the unexplained laws of nature and these latent human powers that people may have. Basically, the idea that humans have untapped spiritual and psychic capacities. And these things and concepts still exist now. People are still trying to quantify these things now. So it just kind of started back then, though. So spiritualism, we think about it as being more in this like parlor setting, but Theosophy is something you can consider more of like the library of it, right? It's trying to build this kind of grand unified theory of the unseen. So Madame Blavatsky, her first major work that she did, her first major book was called Isis Unveiled, and that was published in 1877. And her major work was called The Secret Doctrine, which was published in 1888. And it presented itself as a synthesis of science, religion, and philosophy, weaving together many traditions into one single esoteric cosmology. She really got her power through system building. This is what she was saying. Like, she wasn't just saying, like, I heard a spirit, or I communicated with a spirit. What she's saying is, here's how the whole entire universe actually works. Okay. So that takes it up so many levels beyond what everybody else was doing, right? So she's like really trying to figure out how this whole process was actually working. And I mean, we're still working on these concepts today. And she also became very controversial because she claimed the kind of intellectual and spiritual status Victorian culture mostly reserved for men. So the really, like, the key takeaway is, like, you can notice how the stakes really change when a woman stops just doing the channeling and then actually starts doing the authoring. She's writing, she's creating she's coming up with these concepts. And there were a lot of controversial things about her, which I'm not, for the sake of this podcast, I'm not going to get into all of that. But even if she's someone you're kind of like, oh, I don't know about her, I mean, you can't deny the impact that she had. She helped shape what modern Western esotericism even looks like now. During this time, this was the moment when the occult really stops being like a party trick and it becomes this entire philosophy. And so we really need to pay tribute to her, because even though there were many things about her that were problematic, there were many things about her that really shaped the way that things are now today. And Blavatsky shows us this philosophical power on the kind of like on this grand scale. But the next archetype that I'm going to talk about reveals the danger of spiritual power when it becomes more physical, when it becomes embodied. So archetype number 4 is the embodied medium. This is going to be about Florence Cook. She was an English medium born around 1856. And she was known for claiming to materialize a spirit called Katie King. She died in 1904. Her case became one of the most famous controversies of the mid-1870s, and she was investigated by Sir William Crookes, a prominent scientist who endorsed her phenomena, though many criticized the investigation then and later. This is like, so I'm going to talk about what's called a materialization séance. This wasn't just about, the raps or the table tilting. It was the claim that a spirit could like appear in physical form. And sometimes it would be like stepping out of a cabinet or something like that. And then sometimes it would be, the spirit would be interacting with the different sitters. And sometimes it was being photographed. So you can reference, there's some images of her with this Katie King spirit that exist in occult photography history. I'm going to try to find some of that and post it on my social media. Her story is the cost side of the power conversation, because when spiritual authority becomes physical, it gets completely policed differently. This archetype really shows power through embodiment, power that invites touch, scrutiny, accusation, humiliation. And even if you don't, real versus fraud, the dynamic is the point. Women's bodies became the battleground for the belief. It's like, if the spiritual authority stays abstract, society can tolerate it. But when a woman claims the power to manifest something, suddenly everyone wants to grab it, expose it, and prove she's lying, right? So whether Katie King was a spirit or stagecraft, Florence became a symbol people fought over. And Florence shows us the vulnerability of embodied power. And then we end with an archetype where power becomes quieter but far more prominent, the power of symbols. And now we have the fifth archetype, the symbolic visionary, Pamela Coleman Smith. Okay. Pamela Coleman Smith, often nicknamed Pixie, she was a British artist, illustrator, writer, publisher, and occultist born in 1878 and passed away in 1951. Pixie, she studied at the Pratt Institute. She was not only just a tarot illustrator, that's what she's most famously known for currently. She illustrated over 20 books, wrote 2 collections of Jamaican folklore, edited 2 magazines, and ran the Green Sheaf Press, which was a small press with an emphasis on women writers. The Green Sheaf or the Green Sheaf Press is a big part of her identity as a creator and a curator, and she wasn't waiting to be published. She built her own platform, which is really interesting. She is most famously known for her work illustrating the deck commissioned by A.E. Waite, commonly called the Rider-Waite Tarot deck, now widely referred to as the Rider-Waite-Smith or the Waite-Smith Tarot. And this deck became the standard for modern tarot readers and remains the most widely used or definitely the most influential template in modern tarot culture. Like most people, when they think about tarot, they recognize the artistry of this particular deck and of her art. Her most revolutionary contribution is that she created fully illustrated scenes that made the cards readable in a narrative, like intuitive way, especially compared with the earlier pip style minors. Like the minor arcana was just more of like it didn't have full illustration essentially. But for decades, popular usage centered the deck's male author publisher branding the Rider-Waite. And while a lot of people didn't even know about who the illustrator was, and only later did the wider tarot communities and scholarship more consistently restore Smith in the deck's name. Like that did not come until later. So she is a very influential part of the Victorian spiritualist movement. However, she came like way at the end of it. Her power was not being in a trance. Her power was not some kind of doctrine. It wasn't a society. It wasn't a séance. It was basically this symbolic infrastructure that she created. And she gave the collective psyche this visual language of archetypes, mood, story, this emotional symbolism. And, you know, as far as things within our esoteric and occult culture, the traditional Rider-Waite-Smith tarot deck is one of the most common things that we think about even today. And if you've ever really learned about tarot by looking at a picture, I mean, you really owe it to Pixie because that she's the one that created the art. And our intuition of reading the cards is really framed by what she created. I mean, to me, it feels fascinating. And I often sit and wonder, like, especially with tarot, because there's just so much symbology and there's so much meaning behind each card. I just often wonder, like, what was she thinking? You know, did she know that illustrating these cards would have such an impact? Was she attributing all this symbology to the cards in the same way that we reference it now? It's just really fascinating to think about that. She didn't just illustrate the tarot, she really taught our modern world how to see tarot. There's something so haunting about that. The woman who gives us the high priestess, like she's the one that created the high priestess, yet for a period of time she was completely erased from history. I mean, that feels wild, right? She had this very quiet, creative, enduring power. She wasn't loud and bold about it, but she, through her creativity, she created something that is so long-standing. And I find that just to be so incredibly beautiful. So as we close this Victorian Spiritualism series, what lingers for me is not the crazy ectoplasm, and it's not all the crazy hoaxes that happened. It's not even the spectacle of all of it. It's really the audacity that these women had, right? Women claiming authorship of spiritual meaning in a world that denied them nearly every other platform. Cora, she found her voice through trance. Emma, she structured the belief. Blavatsky, she built the cosmology of it. Florence, she embodied the risk of it. And then Pamela embedded the symbolism into this collective unconscious. The veil was not just something that they lifted to speak to the dead. It was something that they stepped through to become visible. Victorian spiritualism wasn't just about ghosts. It was about women finding a language for power. And as we move into April, we're leaving the seance parlor behind. We're going to step into a different kind of liminal space. April is going to be about exploring the fairy realm, folklore, threshold spaces, the wild edges of the unseen, and those moments where reality feels very thin. Because if this series was about communicating with spirits, April is about listening to myth, listening to the land, listening to the places where the veil thins in a very different way. The veil is not closing. We're just walking through another doorway. And I'll see you there. Bye. Thank you so much for spending this time at the threshold with me. If you want to go deeper, follow me on Instagram at mystical.mama.ash, where I share daily crystal magic and behind the scenes of this liminal life. You can also find resources, previous episodes, and ways to work with me at bigcrystalenergy.com. We're also on YouTube at Big Crystal Energy Podcast. And if this episode resonated with you, please rate it and review it and share it with a friend that you think would connect with it. It would mean so much to me in helping build this beautiful community of other magical friends and crystal workers. Thank you so much. Until next time, bye.